All right, folks, we are winding down with our lessons here. We've got two left, and they really should be seen as two parts of one discussion. And this topic is to introduce you to Ajax and how it can be used with RESTful services. This is going to allow us to be interacting with server-side RESTful services using Ajax. So that probably seems like a lot of strange words used in unusual ways, but just give it a few slides here. As an overview, front-end scripting, like what we've been doing in this course with JavaScript, is inherently limited since storing data for an application on the client's machine would be impractical. So what am I talking about there? Well, remember that when you run JavaScript, when you open a web page and JavaScript runs, remember how anytime you refresh the page, any of the changes you made would kind of go away, right? That's because those JavaScript scripts are running on your client's computer in your client's memory, as in your user's machine and your user's machine's memory. And unless the changes are stored in some persistent way, recorded in a file or something else like what we're going to talk about today, those changes, the browser never knows that those changes need to persist when you refresh. And you basically wipe the memory and start over again. So that's pretty impractical. So data is better stored in a central repository, such as on your application's host server. And a common approach for making this data readily available and allowing our applications to read and write back and forth is to develop an API or service that can facilitate those data requests. So the idea is we've got our user's machine where persistent data is limited, if not impossible. There are a variety of techniques that you can do to have some data persisting locally, but they're not really good for full application data use. You really need something bigger and better and more reliable. And so in addition to your user or the hundreds of users who might be using your application, you're going to have a central host server, something like a web server or a cloud service or something like that, that is going to kind of be the central brain that all of these different user machines are going to communicate with. And how they do that is through a service or API that you develop that allows all these little instances of your application on the user's computers to connect in with special sockets that we're going to look at here to that host machine. All thanks to the internet, of course. So RESTful services are one way that we do this, while a much more in-depth discussion could follow. The heart of the RESTful service is that it makes use of something called HTTP request verbs to facilitate different kinds of data requests. This is really similar to the CRUD structure that we've talked about before, but instead of the CRUD structure, with these verbs we have postcapoodle. That is completely my term. I've never heard it anywhere else, but it's a funny way that you can kind of remember all of this. Postcapoodle, and that stands for post, get, put, and delete. Post or create. In this, we pass any data needed in order to create a new item from our user's machine. We pass it, thanks to a post request, to the API. With a get request, that's where we're reading. This is where we send a get request off to the API. We pass any data needed only in order to filter or sort a search that is, and the data is going to come back to us so that we can then pull it out and display it on the page. So this is similar to what you did in the last exercise, where you were working with the dog breeds and you had a JSON file on your actual file system there. You were doing basically a get request there and reading that data. So imagine that instead of having that file directly on your machine, instead you're using Ajax to call a specific URL and sending it that request via a get. So we have talked about post and get technically, but the other two here are going to be new. Just recall for a moment back to when we were introducing HTML forms. We talked about how you can submit them with two different methods. That's the post method and the get method. Well, technically there were other methods, because what we were talking about really with those was these HTTP request verbs. So post is for creating new entries, get is for reading existing stuff, and then we have put, which is the equivalent of the update, where we pass the primary key for the item that we want to be updated along with any fields that are to actually be changed. And then with the delete, we simply pass the primary key value for the item that we want to delete, because really we don't need to know anything more about the item except the unique identifier so that the database or API can select that item and delete it. So post Gapoodle. So here's how we actually do that with our magical JavaScript and jQuery, thanks to the Ajax method. So jQuery provides helpful shorthand forms that we've covered so far. These are shorthands for a full Ajax call, such as the .load method that we've used and the .get method that we've used. But when we need to make specific HTTP verb calls for our requests, we must use the broader Ajax method as follows. We're going to call $.ajax, and then we have two parameters to pass in. The first parameter is super simple. It's simply the URL for the request, and we're passing that in as a string. But the second parameter is where things get more interesting, in that we have an object that we're going to pass in that contains other configuration options. So look over at the table there, and one of the options that we might be able to pass in is the type, and that is where we're going to specify which HTTP verb we want to use. So that's where we'll specify as a string that it's a get request, a put request, a post request, or a delete request. We can also specify the data that we're going to pass with this request, and that's going to be passed in a form of an object. So what we pass there will depend on the API. The API will typically specify for us what kind of data needs to be passed, whether it's the structure of a new object that we're passing all of those new properties, whether it's the pieces of the object that we're updating, or whether it's filtering or sorting criterion so that we can do an appropriate get request. Now the success and the error options here are where we're actually going to provide some code, and these are going to be functions that are going to be called either when the request succeeds or if the request fails, so that we have kind of a fallback and can treat it appropriately. So imagine we're going to send off a request for data, and we're going to set up handlers, handler functions, so that we're prepared to deal with the result in a positive way. If the desired result comes back, hey, maybe we're going to want to take that data and put it in our page in some fashion. Or maybe we're just going to update some little piece of the page as a result. However, if there's an error, we might want to do something else, like show an error message on the page, or maybe try the request again with maybe a simplified filter or something like that. All right, so that's the structure. We'll be looking at examples next. So here's one where we're using a put request, and we're sending off to the Lego/57175. That's going to be something where we'll have something called an endpoint, and we'll be passing in this case, the 57175 is probably the ID number for the specific Lego item that we want to update in this case, because we're calling a put request. And so with data, we're passing a name. So it looks like what we're doing here is updating the name of this Lego item to Yoda's Jedi Starfighter. So we actually don't know or really care what it was. All we're doing is saying, hey, for 57175, update the name to this new name. And then here you can see how we could set it up if we wanted to have a success function or an error function. And don't be bothered by kind of all the different parameters there on the error. It's just different pieces that we can use to do something intelligent with the results. I want you to know about the error option, but I don't think that we'll care too much to mess with it for our project. It would be a good thing to use, but we don't need to add more complexity to your cognitive load. Just wanted you to see how that could look. Okay, so now let's look specifically, and I believe this is the last slide. Yep. And then we'll actually go and look at a sample application here. There's a common set of calls that you're going to run into. So the post call is usually going to have an endpoint, and the endpoint, by the way, is sort of the socket that we're trying to plug into in that host central database or API. And so that endpoint with the post, so notice how in each one of these the endpoint is the entity name. So if it was a Lego entity, it might be just Lego. If it was a task or a category, like in your application, this is going to be task or category. So task slash or category slash or Lego slash, these are sort of the endpoints, okay? And then notice that on the post and, on the create one and on the get many, we just call the endpoint and the verb. So with just the endpoint and the verb, the API will know what we're looking for and respond accordingly. Of course, with the post, we would call the endpoint and then we would send all the data necessary to create a complete item. Excuse me. With the get many, on the other hand, this is where optionally we might send some filtering or sorting criterion in order to get back a list of many of those items. So creating one Lego entity in the post form there, or getting many of the Lego entities, and perhaps providing some sort and filtering. Now with all of the others, notice that what we're doing with these is dealing with a specific existing instance of the entity. So with the get one, we want to, and with the update one and with the delete one, in all three of these, we call the entity endpoint, but we're also going to pass in the unique ID for the entity that we want to deal with. So if we want to get one very specific entity, we're going to call the entity's endpoint and pass in the ID for that one entity. And we don't need to send anything else because all we want to do is really just retrieve that one item from the database and then store it, or display it on our page. With the update one, we're using the put verb. We're calling the endpoint and passing in the unique ID because remember, in this case, we want to make a change to some entity. So we might have a specific field that we're changing, like we looked at on the last slide where we were changing the name of the that particular Lego item. And so we're gonna pass along with this request the data that we want to change. And then with the delete one, again, we're going to want to call that entity's endpoint, pass in the specific ID of the item we want to delete, and we really don't need to send any other data with it because we don't really care what's in it. We just know this is the one we want to delete, and that is that. Excuse me. All right, so let's take a look at how this could look and know that we're going to come back in a part 2 here to talk about more of the details, specifically with how we package and send the data there. But let's have a look at what this is actually doing. So the idea here is that there's maybe a central service that has all kinds of Lego sets that we can search for, and then we as the user can kind of add them to our Lego collection here on our own machine. So I'm logged in and I have 3 items in my collection here, and I can set the type of each of them to mark them as ones that I own, ones that are on my wish list, and others that I might have sold. All right, so I don't have all of the possible Legos in the world set up in this demo, but I do have this series of options set up. So what we can do is come up here and type in one of those to search for. So let's do the very last one, 75175. Okay, so notice that as I started typing this in, this button changed to Lego not found, right? So a service is being called in the background every time I type this in to see if a matching Lego exists. And when I finally put in the full code and a match is found, oh, the button becomes green because we had a successful service and we can now add it. So if I add this Lego, okay, there it is. That was the A-Wing Starfighter. So it's on my wish list by default, but now I can click on it. So right there we did another get request to go out and get this specific one and its details to display in this page. And we can change the setting. So here we're doing a put request, an update, where we're saying in my collection, I want to mark this as own, that I own this item. Okay, so I have saved that, and now I close. And looks like we need to improve this because this should now say own, right? Well, if I refresh, that now something we skipped saying, I guess, was that when you load the page by default, there's a service call that goes and gets many to figure out which ones are in my collection, and it pulls them up and displays them. Okay, so, oh, you know what? I marked this incorrectly. This is actually one that I own. I did not sell it. Okay, and so it didn't update, so that's a little bug that we would want to fix in the long run. But if I refresh again, you see that we re-trigger the service call where we can now see that that one is not sold anymore, it's owned. Okay, so what if I put in one that is not in my service? Oh, Lego not found. Bummer. But let's add another one here while we're playing, just for fun. It's fun to add Legos to your collection, right? Would you expect me to do anything else? 75169. All right. There we go. Okay, so that looks like that was the Duel on Naboo. Woohoo! So that's on my wish list. We're good to go. Okay, so that's a simple demonstration, but you can imagine there's a good bit of code going on behind the scenes before you get frightened. Let me scroll down to kind of the control center here. Here is my DRE, where we're kind of wiring up all the things that can happen in our system. So, of course, one of the things that happens is, by default, we want to get all the user Legos. So this is where a service call is going to probably happen that goes out and gets many. So that's going to be a get request. But we don't want to get every single Lego in the whole system. We really only want this user's Legos. So that's where we're going to provide a filter that says not all Legos, but just the ones that this user owns. Okay, so let's go look at that function. Get user Legos. Where are you? Oh, here we are. Okay. So there's the function call, and notice that all we have inside of here is that Ajax structure that we just talked about, where we are passing in the endpoint, and because we're getting many, we don't pass an ID on with the end of this. Okay, so now we've got this object that allows us to provide a type. In this case, we want the type of get, to send any data that we want. In this case, we're sending a filter for where the user is equal to the current user. And sorting, we want to sort the Legos by Lego name. And then we want to provide the success function. So on success, we're going to call this little function, and look at what we're doing here. We are converting the data using parse JSON, which is something we're going to cover in the next lesson. And we're now using a normal GET request to load the tiles template from our system. Ba-doop, ba-doop, ba-doop. There he is. And then we're going to inject the data and display it on the page just like you've done in previous exercises. Okay, so you can see that this is kind of just more stuff up front so that we can make use of this API rather than just loading a local file. But the rest inside of here is something already very familiar to you, or should be from the last exercise at least, where we're now taking that data, injecting it into a template that we've loaded, and displaying it on the page. So you can see here's the Lego tiles file, where we're using handlebars to loop through all of the Lego users that we get, or user Legos that we get. For each one, we are just setting up some display where we're going to show the name and the ID and the image that is set up for that. This is all data that's going to come from the API. Okay, so let's just put in a couple little console logs to kind of get a sense of what that looks like. So when we make the Ajax request, There is the data. I'm going to log basically the data that we get back from the request. And I'm going to do it, let's see, let's do it here, and let me just do it down here. I want to show you what we get back. So one of your readings, I think, covered a couple of different things we can do with console, including console.table, which allows us to take the data that we get back from a service call like this that is kind of highly structured and actually display it on a little table. So if I come here and refresh, now when that service call happens, if I did it right, get user Legos. Let's just do console.log and see if that changes anything. There it is. All right, console log, user Legos. So you can see that what I'm getting back is a JSON object with what? 5 items in it. And when I open up an item, you can see I get its ID. And then I have a user ID, but then I have a type object that has the name of the type, that's like owned or sold or whatnot. And then I have a whole Lego object here as well that includes all the different pieces of the Lego that I can display on the page. Okay, so as we get into your project, I'm going to be developing an API that you will be calling. So you don't have to worry a bit about the actual API itself. So I'll be developing that, and I'll be developing documentation as well that will tell you what all the endpoints are, what data you should pass to the endpoints, what data you're going to get back from those service calls. I'm even going to be prescribing some of this code for you as well. So the decision making will basically be for you to kind of spell out some of the details in the data as needed, and then of course writing the code that goes down in here depending on what you want. So I don't have this example here available yet, but I hope to by the end of the next lesson so that you actually have a fully living and breathing application that you can look at as a reference as you work on your own application. And I will also have much more in the way of instructions to guide you through. Because sure, this might look overwhelming, but let me just talk a little bit more about it at the chance of kind of putting you a little bit more at ease. So we were just talking about the get user Legos that was called here inside of the DRE, but notice that everything else here is just a whole bunch of listeners that are set up to respond to the various actions that can happen in this application, like putting input into the search bar or clicking on the Add Lego button. Or some more specific things dealing with hyperlink or button clicks. In this case, they're probably dealing with different things like showing the modal or changing the type of one of the Legos or actually deleting a Lego from your collection. And then one more for dealing with the modal. So basically, we've kept the DRE as simple as possible by simply putting here the main part of our event bindings, where we're specifying which item to listen on, what to listen for, and the function to call as a result. So then each of those functions would just be defined somewhere else. So in this case, from the top down to the bottom, I think I've just alphabetized the functions, almost alphabetized them, where then we're just kind of piecing off each of the bits of code that needs to happen. And I intend to prescribe all of this structure for you. Of course, writing it will be up to you, but I'll say, hey, you're going to want to have an event listener for this item on your page, and it should call a function called get user Legos. And then I'll probably do a flowchart or just a kind of bulleted list of what needs to happen inside of that function that will be a guide for you. Okay, well, that should do it for today's lesson. Look forward to more coming in the next one. And hopefully this helps you better visualize what's coming up for this last project.